You have been lied to. Countless historians tout the Crusades as a deep moral stain on world history, and while the Crusades were far from perfect, the purposes of the Crusades were entirely justified. In the last video, we discussed what led Christians to think that the Crusades were essentially necessary, with hundreds of years of churches being destroyed and territories being conquered. But that's not all the Muslims were doing. For 400 years, Muslim pirates were essentially destroying commerce to the Christian and European world. In fact, many attribute the Dark Ages from 600 to 1000 AD to Muslims essentially forcing Europe into a form of seclusion. For example, when Muslim invaders conquered Egypt during the 7th century, the shipments of papyrus drastically reduced heading into Europe, leading to less and less books being written during the Dark Ages. Not only was trade an issue, but Muslims treated Christians as second-class citizens called dhimmis. They were forced to pay a special tax, and if they were unable to do so, they were enslaved, imprisoned, and even executed. The ones that could afford to pay the tax didn't have many of the rights afforded to them, like being able to testify against Muslims in court, owning weapons, and building new churches. The large-scale persecution of Christians would only grow worse. Muslims largely perpetuated the slave trade at this point, and they enslaved tens of millions of Africans and 2 million Europeans, most of them Christians. So after hundreds of years of literal torture, abuse, and death, the Pope finally called upon the Christian world to go on a crusade with the famous phrase, Deus vult, God wills it, and countless Christians sacrificed literally everything to protect Christendom. Now that we've painted a vivid picture for why the Crusades were morally justified, let's talk about the events of the Crusades themselves. For one, the scale of the killings committed by the Christians during the Crusades is blown way out of proportion. For example, many historians say that Christians killed 70,000 Muslims in Jerusalem when the city fell in 1099, saying there were rivers of blood, but their sources are disreputable Islamic historians, many of them who have conflicting accounts. They try to exaggerate the Christian violence while downplaying the Muslim atrocities. Meanwhile, one Muslim historian cites there being 3,000 killed, and multiple Latin historians cite there being 10,000 killed. But one thing's for sure, during the 100-year period after which Christians controlled Jerusalem, Muslims were not persecuted the same way that Christians were persecuted by the Muslims. Not only this, but certain Christian groups like the Knights of St. Lazarus are commonly lost in the fog of mistruths told by these revisionist historians. These knights cared for sick and injured Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Now, that isn't to say that some of these Christian crusaders didn't commit acts of violence that are incongruent with their proclaimed faiths, especially later on when some of the crusades digressed from their original purpose. But it is to say that the crusades in principle were entirely justified, and the accounts of unjustified violence are blown way out of proportion.